ثم القاضي ثم إمام الحي ثم الولي الذكر. Right? So there is who should be leading the funeral prayer, right? So normally a person has authority over themselves, right? A person prays themselves, they give the charity themselves, right? But the person's dead. So who has authority? Who has the right to lead the funeral prayer? So broadly, there's two conflicting interests. There's the right of the deceased, insofar as what if they wanted someone to lead? So there's the right of the deceased. The other is that Salat al-Janaza is a fard kifaya, right? It's a fard kifaya. And the matters of the furud al-kifaya, of the communal obligations, right? Who's responsible? Whom does the right, the responsibility and rights of communal matters return to? Those who have communal authority, which would be the sultan or the one appointed by the sultan, right? Etc. down. So the public dimension of Salat al-Janaza, is it given precedence or the personal dimension? So Zubayr died. He finally went and proposed to Zubaydah. She said no. He had a heart attack and he died. But he left in his will that he wanted Uncle Jamil to lead his janazah prayer. That was his will. But Mullah Hamza ji is the local imam, right? And the Amir of Muslimville is Sidi Farid. So Sidi Farid's present as the mayor of Muslimville, he would be given precedence. He's not present, the imam of the neighborhood, because would be given precedence over the person chosen by the deceased in the Hanafi school. So there's a conceptual element to it, but there's also, it goes back to what is the precedent from the Sunnah? What is the precedent from the Sunnah? Which is tricky. The precedent from the Sunnah is not so clear. Why? Because the Prophet ﷺ leads both as the Amir, as the Sultan, right? Or as the Qadi and the Imam, right? And anyone would want the Prophet ﷺ to pray over them, right? So it's actually a tricky thing to distinguish, any particular action of the Prophet ﷺ, in which prophetic capacity is it being done. So one of the great Maliki jurists, Imam al-Qarafi, has a book called Al-Tamyiz, right? And it's a longer title of the distinguishing between the actions of the Prophet ﷺ as the political leader or the judge, or in giving fatwa or giving religious advice. Right? There's different categories of action. And the fuqaha looked carefully at that. But that's where in the Hanafi school, the practice of the Sahaba is illustrative, because people died after, right? And so ijtihad has come in. And there's a difference in this matter between the Hanafis and others. But in the Hanafi school, the Sultan, because his wilaya is amma, his authority is general, number one, and because the Imam, the leader, there's an obligation to have respect and deference for the leaders, right? Of course, there's assumptions made regarding that, etc. Although most of the later scholars said that practically, in later times, with the general prevalence of ignorance in religious leaders, of political leaders, the religious leadership would be given precedence over them. So if there's a qadi and the imam of the masjid, the qadi, because the presumption is that they would have religious knowledge, would be given precedence. The qadi, because their authority is deputized from the authority of the ruler. Right? There's public authority, it goes to the sultan, and it divulges from the sultan to the qadi, to the local rulers, etc. From the center of authority, it is deputized authority. So then the qadi, then the imam of the neighborhood, because the imam of the neighborhood that they were in, now a reason is given there, but this is a hikmah, what's mentioned in Maraqi al-Falah, that because he was content with them in their lifetime. Right? That's a hikmah, that's not the underlying reason. It's also because the imam of the masjid has authority to lead the prayer in the masjid. So that's sort of the public authority versus the personal choice. Right? Right? In some other schools, however, if the imam of the masjid is there versus the person chosen by the deceased, the person chosen by the deceased would be given precedence, but not in the Hanafi school. And it goes back to what was this order, right? Now, if the imam of the neighborhood is not there, right, or likewise, someone deputized by the imam of the neighborhood, right? Some masajid have an order, like they have assistant imams and so on, especially large masjids, right? Right? And they differed on this reasoning that, well, the person accepted the local imam to pray behind. So some of the Hanafis, and Tahtawi quotes this from some of the later Hanafis, like al-Burhan al-Halabi, that if it's known that the person didn't like the local imam, then it would not be recommended for the imam to lead them in their prayer. But there's two potential reasonings. One is because the person accepted that this person be their local imam, right? And your local masjid is presumably either your nearest mosque or the one that you typically prayed in. People typically prayed in their local masjid. But if someone prayed was a regular at another mosque, presumably they'll be buried there. Like buried by the imam of that mosque. Because the Salat al-Janazah is not supposed to be performed in the masjid by default. So that's the consideration. Now, in the absence of the imam of the neighborhood, then is ثُمَّ الْوَلِيُّ الذَّكَرُ, then the guardian, then the nearest male guardian, right? Right? Except that the father is given precedence over the son, because in the presence of a son, like if a woman dies, if a woman's getting married, who is given precedence to be her wali? Her son or her father, right? If a woman's getting remarried, let's say, right? So here, if a son is present and a father is present, the father would be given precedence. And that goes back to the issue of what is the order of wilaya, right? Right? Because there's an order in nikah, right? That the order of nikah is that your immediate wali is your male child, then the father, then the brethren, then the uncles, right? Right? So if in the case of a woman in marriage, Like an adult woman, if she has an adult son, the adult son would be her wali in remarriage before her father. And there's reasons that's outside our scope here. So that's the order of wilaya when it comes to nikah. Child, male child, البنوة ثم الأبوة ثم الأخوة ثم العمومة. So the male child, then parent, then brother, then uncle. But here, the father would be given precedence over the son, right? And one of the reasons why the father is given precedence, because the dua of the parent for the child is one of the 3 du'as that has been related in hadith in the Musnad of Imam Ahmad and elsewhere. One of the 3 types of du'as that is always answered, right? And the hadith you can find in the Maraqi. It's related by Imam Ahmad in his Musnad. So he says, وَلِمَنْ لَهُ حَقُّ التَّقَدُّمْ أَنْ يَأْذَنَ لِغَيْرِهِ. And whoever has the right of precedence has the right to allow another to lead instead. Right? So the sultan is there, they can allow the qadi to lead. If the qadi is there, he can say to the imam of the masjid, you go ahead. Right? The imam of the masjid could allow a scholar, for example, who's senior to them, to lead. Because it's the imam's right to lead in the masjid their appointed imam of, but like a personal knowledge there, they could. It's not their responsibility to defer to them, but they could choose to. Likewise in Salat al-Janazah. And here is where a certain amount of discretion is allowed, and wise, right? Right? Which is why it's important for, especially the large masajid, to have people of knowledge connected to them, right? And these things should be processes. If there's a janazah, so it shouldn't just show up and, okay, let's lead the janazah. Yeah, masajid should have processes. And in the masail where there's khilaf, right, it is up to the, yarhamukumullah, it is up to the people who have authority in a place to set what their guidelines are. Right? Right? So there's some things where there's difference of opinion. And you are bound, if you go to a certain place, right, where there's people in charge, and they choose a particular opinion, then you can't say, I disagree. I don't know if it's still the case, but Islamic Forum used to have they used to have a law, no sunnah prayers during the khutbah. It's still there? That's beautiful. Like, I've sometimes had to actually move to the side on the mimbar. Someone comes right to the front. If it weren't for the lack of respect of deen, I would call them out. And that's what's the right thing to do. I said, excuse me, can you please cut your prayer and go to the back, and if you wish to pray? Right? But people don't have respect for religion or knowledge or anything, so, But that's shirk. You can't pray to me. Right? If someone's praying directly towards the imam, that's not allowed. It's disturbing other people. So in that case, you say, well, I'm Shafi'i. So sorry, if this is the regulation here, then you have to respect it. If you don't like it, go somewhere else. Right? Why? Because that's up to them. Right? And you could say, I disagree. Well, then don't go pray there. The masjid is not a public place in one sense, right? It's a public place in terms of the permission to attend, right? But its administration is not by anarchy. Its administration is what is a masjid? A masjid is a waqf, is a specific type of waqf, some a land that has been endowed in perpetuity as a house of worship. There is a group of people who are entrusted. So a waqf is a trust, and the people running it are entrusted with taking care of its best interests. Right? So one has to be careful. Right? فَإِنْ صَلَّ غَيْرُهُ, if other than them pray, right? So someone shows up with a janazah and they just say, well, I don't know where everyone is, I'm going to pray. Or someone says, Sidi Hamza was Zubair's best friend. Said, he was my best friend. He died a martyr. I'm really affected. I'm going to lead. So Imam Azhar can say, given an unauthorized performance of Salatul Jumu'ah, we are now going to be repeating the funeral prayer, right? That's within their right. Insha'a, if they wish. And this could be, and normally you have to use discretion, right? This would be if there's a detriment. Someone hastened to do the janazah before the whole congregation came, right? Before the official congregation, etc. Right? وَلَا مَعَهُ مَنْ صَلَّ مَعَ غَيْرِهِ. But people who already prayed in the prior congregation, the Hamza congregation, wouldn't perform it again.
And would the fard kifaya be fulfilled for the first unauthorized?
But not properly. Would the fard kifaya be fulfilled? Yes, but not properly. Right? Because the Salat al-Janazah is a public, is a fard kifaya, right? There's certain guidelines for it. So someone just goes and says, well, she was my wife, I want to pray over her. And sometimes when people, at times of death, sometimes you have to, it needs a lot of sensitivity because people get worked up, right? People get worked up. Sometimes they behave unpredictably. It's not, death is a pretty final worldly state, right? People get all shaken up and sometimes they make unpredictable choices, which is why it's very important to have clear policies in place. So when people said, so if someone says we have a janazah, to say these are our policies, etc., so that it avoids, especially in situations where there's a breakdown of authority, right? People don't have that deference and respect, right? They need to be clear policies or clear deference. That okay, ask so and so. Right? It has to be clear. Clear authority. ومن له ولاية التقدم فيها أحق ممن أوصى له الميت بالصلاة عليه. Whoever has the right of precedence is given precedence over the person selected by the deceased. على المفتى به, according to the fatwa position. Right, and this is the chosen position in the Hanafi school, right? But it should be considered, right? It should be considered, right? It should be considered, and because this is a matter where there's difference with the Shafi'is and others, right? So it requires due consideration, right? And that's why, because in our time, especially with a diverse community, etc., one side is diverse and the other side there's ignorance. It's important to clarify the policy. I've been to multiple janazas where there's an argument going on as to who should lead. Okay, so that's not good. Right? وَإِن دُفِنَ بِلَا صَلَاةٍ نَسْأَلُ اللَّهَ الْعَافِيَةَ. Right? If someone's buried without being prayed over, right? So someone's buried. Burial refers to two things. Dafn, if they're put into the grave and they weren't prayed over, you just take them out and pray over them. If they're just buried, but the dust wasn't put over them, just take them out because they're not yet buried. They're just in a holy place. They're in a hole. They're only buried when the dust has gone over them. So when dufina, that's why the commentary mentions uhila alayhi turab, and the dust is placed over them. Bila salatin sulli ala qabrihi. Right? Then one prays over their grave. One prays at their grave. Right? وَإِن لَمْ يُغَسَّلْ, even if they weren't washed. Right? Because now it's kind of late to, because there's an inviolability to the burial process, right? So someone has been buried and the sand's over them, but what happened? They weren't washed. So their right has been forfeited, so to speak, right? Out of negligence. So you can pray at their grave. And that's important to notice what's the difference between this and issues coming up. What's the issue coming up? If they're buried with someone else's property. Okay? So, see, Hamza's best friend wanted to monitor their heart rate because they're having heart palpitations. So they borrowed Sidi Hamza's new, health monitor that can take your ECG and so on. But then the guy died. So the family of the deceased said, "What a beautiful watch. We'd like him to be buried in it." He got buried. But that watch had a very expensive strap and so on. It was Sidi Hamza's wedding gift and so on. So he'll be in big trouble. He said, "No, I'm not going to waive my right to that." I said, "We'll pay you for it." He said, "No, I had a custom $2,000 strap on it, etc. I want it back." So we'll see what happens to that when we get to it. Right? So even if they weren't washed, then they're prayed over at their grave. Right? ما لم يتفسخ. Right? As long as the grave as long as the body would not have disintegrated. Right? And how long does that take place? That goes back to those who have knowledge of the matter. And that's the general thing. Right? The things that require worldly expertise, one sees those who have experience in the matter. Why? Because it depends on the type of soil, the amount of moisture or wetness of the ground, the heat, many different factors, right? Right? And here he mentions a related point that if there's only a small group of people, right? So he mentions this in the commentary. إذا كان القوم سبعة, right? If there's only 7 people to pray behind the janazah, what do? Normally, in a regular prayer, you make them all one full line. But if there's 7, right? There's just 7 people. One should be the imam. Then there should be 3 behind them. 3 behind the imam. So they're a jama'ah. And then 2 people behind that, the 3. And then 1 person. So to make it into a row of 3. Into 3 rows. Why? Because it's come in hadith, right? related by Imam al-Tirmidhi that whoever's prayed upon by 3 rows will be forgiven by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? And now Salat al-Janazah can be tricky, but unlike the Fard prayer, what's the best row to pray in the Janazah prayer? The back row. Of course, that doesn't mean, that's if one has a choice. If when the Janazah is called, you're standing, you pray where you are, right? Because otherwise you'd cause chaos. And there's a wisdom in it, because also people would want to go to the front. It's to have humility. It's like one of the great scholars of Damascus passed away. All these people, they kind of lost their minds. All these people were almost fighting to go and pray right at the front. And ironically, the closest students of that Shaykh, they were way at the back. Why? Because that's the adab in a janazah. Right? Where someone prominence died out of love, out of respect, out of fervor. Everyone wants to be at the front. So it's from the adab of the janazah to hold back. And you have greater reward for that. And there's wisdoms in that. He mentions that in there. Now, what happens if there's multiple janazas? 4 people have come to Jamia, to Jamia al-Farid. There's 4 janazas, 4 different families, right? 4 janazas have come. So he tells us, وَإِذَا اجْتَمَعَتِ الْجَنَائِزِ فَالْإِفْرَادُ بِالصَّلَاةِ لِكُلٍّ مِّنْهَا أَوْلَى. If there are multiple janazas, then performing each one separately is superior. Because each has their individual right. Okay? So there's a janazah, Asr prayer on a Sunday, someone dies, there's 4 people to be prayed on. So you do 4 janazas. That is superior. Right? وَيُقَدَّمُ الْأَفْضَلُ فَالْأَفْضَلُ. And the most superior is goes first. Right? And by the criteria of religious superiority. Right? So knowledge, righteousness, age, right, etc. Right? Unless someone came first, right? Someone comes first, you pray over them. Then other one comes, you pray over them. You wouldn't wait. So, Shaykh so and so is coming, we have to pray over them, right? So let's say there's a car accident. There's a big accident. 8 people died. So they're washing them. So they wash one person, brought them to the masjid. You pray over them. Second one came, you pray over them. Even they wash the Shaykh the last, right? For whatever reason, right? So إِلَّمْ يَكُنْ بِهِ سَبْقٍ, as he says in the commentary, right? وَإِنِ اجْتَمَعْنَا وَصَلَّ مَرَّةً إِنْ شَاءَ جَعَلَهُمْ صَفًّا, right? عريضا يقوم عند أفضلهم وإن شاء جعلها صفا طويلا مما يلي القبلة حيث يكون صدر كل منهما قدام الإمام. So, if multiple janazas come, what is superior is, what's superior?
One by one.
To pray on each one separately. But you could do do it together, right? And something like, let's say, a whole bus blew up, or there's a big crash, 50 people died. Right? It's not feasible to do 50 janazas, people, right? Let's say. So what does one do? Nasallallahu al-afiyah. One can pray just once over them all. And there's two ways to do this. You can line them up lengthwise along the qibla with the most virtuous of them in the middle. That be just in terms of the adab, right? The most righteous, the most learned, the most righteous, the oldest, right? According to the criteria of who goes given precedence, that is superior. So you can either make them, just across, or, and some said this is superior, right? Is you make it one row, and this is feasible if only a few, right? So you line them up with, one, in rows, and the imam faces the chest of each of them. And there's a few other possibilities. You could do it in a diagonal way where the chest of each is next to the chest of the other. So it'd be in a kind of fanned out manner. But that's, and this is typical. Now, this would also depend on the space, right? The asl is that the janazah is done in the musalla of the musalla of the maqbara. The maqbara, the burial ground, supposed to have a graveyard. So the maqbara is supposed to have a prayer area. So they pray there. But then practically the problem is that most people would not go to the graveyard. Right? With people's lifestyles, with distances and so on. So we'll see the issue of praying in the masjid. We'll come to it in a minute. Right? Right? وإن شاء جعلهم صفا عريضا ويقوم عند أفضلهم. So if you make it one long row, one behind the other, then one stands immediately in front of the imam should be the best of them. ويقوم عند أفضلهم. Right? Right? جعلها صفا طويلا مما يلي القبلة حيث يكون صدر كل قدام الإمام. Right? So they're just in a straight line. Right? وراء الترتيب, and one takes into account the order. Right? فيجعل الرجال مما يلي الإمام. So he places the men immediately in front of the imam. Then the children after them. Then any hermaphrodites, and they're much rarer and have always been much rarer than the scholars. The books, it's just if any, then the women, right? Right. Now, if many people die, there could also be the issue of how do you bury them all? Let's say we don't have enough space, right? So they all there has to be a mass burial. And sometimes it can happen in a time of conflict, right? That many people died and there's still active bombings. We need to bury these people, but we can't dig holes all over the place. We kind of have to hide. And this happens in war zones. Sometimes there's like aerial bombing and they're bombing, so they have to they can't become, like the living will also have to be buried after that burial. right? So if there's a need to bury them together, they can be buried together. ولو دفنوا بقبر واحد وضعوا على عكس هذا. If they're buried in one grave, which is permissible, if there's need, then they are buried in the opposite of this order. Right? So therefore, right? Who's on top? The best of them. Right? So the order is first by, and then there's also the gender thing, which gets quite tricky. You can do the mathematics of it. And then, so now he's mentioning, miscellaneous issues related to the funeral and the funeral prayer, right? Funeral, burial, funeral prayer. Closing off the section, so he says, وَلَا يَقْتَدِي بِالْإِمَامِ مَنْ وَجَدَهُ بَيْنَ التَّكْبِيرَتَيْن. So one does not, if you reach the funeral prayer and the imam is between takbirs, you wait till the imam gives a takbir and you join the imam with their takbir. Right? So the imam, in his second takbir, you don't just join in. The superior thing to do is you wait till the imam gives a takbir and then one gives the takbir. This is in terms of recommendedness. Or ويوافقه في دعائه, right? And the imam, so the latecomer in the funeral prayer, what do they do? يوافقه في دعائه, right? So in the funeral prayer, what does the latecomer do? They do what the imam is doing. Right? So if you catch the imam in the, like after first takbir is thana, second takbir is salah ala nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam, which is also dua. Third takbir is dua on the deceased. Fourth takbir, there's nothing. So if you caught the imam in the third takbir, you caught the third takbir, and you know it's the third takbir, what do you say? The dua on the deceased. So if you know, and why would that be? Because you're walking up to them, right? So you saw them give the takbir, but you're walking up to them. So they're giving one takbir, second takbir. You caught the imam in the third takbir. So make dua on the deceased, and then you make up what you've missed, right? So he says, ثم يقضي ما فاته قبل رفع الجنازة. And then one makes up what one missed of the takbirs before the janazah is lifted, right? With dua. So while making dua, right, the other things, as best one can, right? And if one's delayed slightly, such that one or two takbirs left, then one hastens. So if you can do them quickly before they pick up the janazah, that's superior. But if you're finishing off before so they're starting picking it up, but before they put it on their shoulders, that's okay. Right? So you finish it quickly. So don't make a really lengthy dua, basically, right?
That's if you've caught the dua and then now you have to recite the salawat. So you caught the imam late, you made the dua with the imam, and the imam is giving the salam now, but you have two more takbir to catch up and to recite the thana and the salawat.
Yeah. So what is the principle in the prayer? You've caught what you've caught, and you make up what you missed. So the same principle is applying, right? You caught what you caught. So if you get there after the third, at the third takbir, so you give the third takbir with the imam, so you caught what you caught. So you do the third takbir and its action, the fourth takbir, and it's nothing, you don't give the salam with the imam after his fourth takbir, which is your second. You have two takbirs left. Your remaining takbirs, what are you making up? What you missed, which is the first takbir. So the basic principle is you caught what you caught and you make up what you missed. That applies to the fard prayer, and that applies to the the janazah as well. ومن حضر يعني بعد sorry, what do you say? ولا ينتظر تكبير الإمام من حضر تحريمته. Right? Right? If you're present when the imam gives the opening takbir, but you didn't give it right away, then you don't wait for the next takbir. Right? It happened to me once in Pakistan. I was masjid near Tariq Road. The wall of the Qibla was all made of glass, and the dome, I think, had there's a lot of light coming into the masjid, all making the wall shine. Because there's Quranic verses on it, and they're made of glass. And all verses on, all the Quranic verses related to knowledge of the unseen. So I got there, I wasn't expecting a janazah. I was with an uncle of Omar's. I get there and so where is this janazah? So I look up. Oh my God, what's it? I know they give the takbir. I almost missed the full first takbir. Why? Because it's caught up. So there, I wouldn't wait till the next takbir because I was there. So this is called, it's like being what's called a mudrik. Right? So in that case, you were there, but you delayed giving the takbir. You give it. You don't wait till the next. It's the one who arrived after a takbir, right? ومن حضر بعد التكبيرة الرابعة قبل السلام فاتته الصلاة. After the fourth takbir, before the salam, you missed the prayer. Right? Why? So this is من حضر بعد التكبيرة الرابعة. Whoever arrives after the fourth takbir. Because if you're there when the fourth takbir is given, then you can still join in. Pretty hard to know that it's the fourth takbir, right? It's a bit of practically a theoretical issue. Because you can only guess it's the fourth takbir. So normally, you get there, if you think they've just started, you wait till they give the next takbir. Right? So you could diagram this. Right? If you're there when a takbir was given, you say Allahu Akbar. You entered between takbirs, you wait till they give the next takbir. Right? So this you could diagram it out. And that's useful because these things actually happen. You entered the masjid. Were you present when the takbir was given, but it was just a question of getting to the row of prayer, right? So let's say if at Jamiat al-Ansar, for example, you entered the masjid. Now you reach the hall, but you're away from the rows. So you caught the second takbir. It's the second takbir. Okay? So you're present in the place where the prayer is performed. Let's leave the masjid thing out of it. Okay? You're walking up. So if you're present there when the takbir is given, you just join in. If you got there between takbirs, you didn't see a takbir being given or hear it, then you wait till the next takbir is given. But if you got there after the last takbir, how? let's say you could hear it on the way, it's on the loudspeaker. So you weren't in the place, right? So let's say there's an elevated place called, there's Musalla al-Janaza. So you're walking to it, you're not there yet. They say, prayer is beginning. Say Allahu Akbar. Say that's first takbir. You're walking towards second takbir, third takbir, fourth takbir, and then you get there. Can you join in? No, because you're present after the fourth takbir. But you're walking there, you got to the Musalla al-Janaza, but it was someone really unpopular. Everyone was fed up of Zubayr and his antics, so there's only 7 people praying over him. So what happens? If you got there, but you had to walk to the front, right? But you were there for the last takbir, can you still join in before the salams? Right? That's why he used the term man hadara. Whoever arrives, meaning in the place where the salah is done, then this is the fiqh of it, right? If you arrive at the place where the prayer is done after the final takbir, you don't join in. If you think it's, and if you don't know which takbir it is, then you assume that there's more takbirs left. That's a reasonable assumption. Fi sahih, according to the sound opinion. Then he says, وَتُكْرَهُ الصَّلَاةُ عَلَيْهِ فِي مَسْجِدِ الْجَمَاعَةِ وَهُوَ فِيهِ. It is makruh to pray over the dead in the congregational mosque with the deceased in it. So in some countries like Pakistan, a lot of masajid, what they've done is there's a door in the mihrab. So what do? They bring the janazah outside. Have you seen it? Yeah. They put the janazah outside the mihrab, and they'll pray from the inside. Right. So the deceased is outside the masjid. They'll pray inside. Now this gets tricky. Right? There's of course there's a matter where there's difference of opinion with some of the other schools, right? What is the reason for this? Right? What is the reason for this? Right? Is this karaha tahrimiyya or tanzihiyya? Right? And it would go back to what is the cause of the dislikedness. Right? Some said, well, it's a possibility that the masjid could get najis. I said, that's not very likely. Right? Because there's a possibility that someone could lose their bowel control in the masjid or something, like وَلِعِيَاذُ بِاللَّهِ. But unless it's highly likely someone's got wild diarrhea, they shouldn't go into the masjid. Right? So, right? So there's causes. So Al-Kamal ibn al-Humam chose, and Imam al-Shumbulali takes that, the karahis of tanzih, it being somewhat disliked. Is it fear of najasa, or that this is not what the Prophet ﷺ used to do? Then what is the dilala of the fact the Prophet ﷺ did not used to do it there? Right? So, and then there's the issue of, there's hadith, right? That whoever prays upon the janazah in a masjid, they have nothing. فَلَا شَيْءَ لَهُ. They have nothing. But what does that mean? Right? What does that mean? So, some said they have nothing because they've gone against the sunnah. But there's also the argument that maybe it applies to, if they're praying in they're praying at the maqbara and you go to pray in the masjid instead, then you missed it. So the hadith is open to some interpretation, right? So generally, right? Generally, the Hanafis took the karaha, they said it's makruh. Why? Because the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ was that you would pray at the maqbara. Is there any clear prohibition from the Prophet ﷺ about praying it in the masjid? No. Is there a clear legal harm in doing so? One meaning is the fact the Prophet ﷺ did not do it in the masjid. Right? But the Prophet ﷺ not doing it is not the strongest indicator of permission or non-permission. Right? It means all else being equal, it would be better to do it that way. Right? So that would indicate that it is something that's in itself makruh tanzihan. Right? And that's why Al-Kamal ibn Hulman particularly argued that. Now there's other arguments that, well, the masajid weren't built for this. Well, that would only apply if the waqf of the masjid does not encompass that. Right? So if you're in a land where that's not done, then you're now busying the masjid with something it was not built for. Right? But if in a land where they do this, then that reason does not arise as well. And the reason I'm giving a little bit of background on this is because sometimes people get worried, in the Hanafi school is wrong. First, no. They say, just calm down a little bit. You know, what most of the later Hanafi scholars said, the karah is of tanzih. There is no prophetic prohibition against praying in the masjid. The hadith that's in Sunan Abi Dawood, that man salla ala janazatin fil masjid fala shay'a lahu, has nothing, right? Right? There's difference actually, one in the narration itself. Is it fala shay'a lahu or fala shay'a alayhi? There's nothing for him or there's nothing against him. Which is why the Sahaba and the Salaf differed on the interpretation of hadith. And what's the context of the hadith? Right? So at best it's dhanniyu dilala. It's not strong in its indication. Right? So yes, it became the inherited practice of in many Hanafi lands that Hanafis wouldn't, in Hanafi masajid, they would not pray in the masjid. The fact they wouldn't do it, it's not because it's something against. Right? Most of the reason, fear of najasa. Have you ever seen like stuff squirting out of a dead body in the masjid? No, it's not like people like it's wrapped up, it's shrouded, etc. Like possibilities of stuff getting out, not a big possibility. Talweeth. Number two, the Prophet ﷺ not doing something does not necessarily indicate that it's wrong. Now, in itself, it would be superior for there to be a musalla of janaza by the graveyards. In itself, that would be superior. But practically, especially even traditionally when the cities got big, that's not practical. Graveyards themselves got filled up. In many Muslim land, Cairo, they started doing, multi-layered burials because there's no space. I got a question from India where they bury every 10, 50, X number of years, they bury over the same grave because the Muslim graveyards are burstingly full. Where are you going to fit a large congregation at the graveyard? So there's multiple considerations. Now, in itself, if you're going to custom build a masjid and you could keep the grave like right behind the qibla, then in itself, that would be one way that the ulama dealt with it, right? And that's what he'll mention next. But the reason it's important to be aware that it's the karaha here, most of the scholars said, it's in itself the karaha is of tanzih. It is somewhat disliked. But then the practical implementation, which is in many a land, like, in places like Syria, etc., Damascus, many places where they have Hanafis, they said, where are we going to, like, if you don't hold in the masjid, where are people going to get to that they know? Gather safely, serene, people gather for the prayer, do the janazah. There's the practical consideration, right? So, and that's why in the amalan, the amal in many a land where there are Hanafis, like Damascus, elsewhere, the ulama practically say, okay, sometimes the karaha, even when it's karaha tanzih, sometimes the karaha is not intrinsic, that the prayer is wrong. It's because of secondary considerations, right? Is there any prohibition about it? No, right? Is there any prohibition? Are you doing something? Prophet ﷺ said, don't pray it in the masjid. No. It's understood from surrounding considerations. So someone said, no, Hanafis aren't supposed to do this. No, it's allowed in the Hanafi school. It's just, in itself, would have been better to do it in that, if that were feasible. But when it's not feasible, the applied position practically there's no karaha. There's no karaha. Like, if someone's praying at one of our local masajid here, says, am I doing something makruh? No. It has to be made clear. It's a fard kifaya. You're rewarded for a fard kifaya. You don't say, نويت الصلاة المكروهة في المسجد لله تعالى. No, you're doing a fard kifaya. Right? A fard kifaya. And one should, when you're doing an obligatory act, you have gratitude that Allah is facilitating for you to perform an obligatory act. أو خارجه وبعض الناس في المسجد على المختار. Or one could have the body outside it and at least some people within the masjid. That's sort of, Yeah. Now, there, Imam Ash-Shurunbulali mentions a tanbih, which is also important, which also complicates the issue, right? He said, تُكْرَهُ الْجَنَائِزْ فِي الشَّارِعِ. Janazas are disliked on the street. Why? Because the street, and there's fiqh related to the street, which is, the street is the right of everybody. Let's say, some random brother Anas is very busy, right? To make ends meet for his wife and 16 children, he has to put in 14-hour days. So he's going between client and client. Now, see, Hamza organizes the janazah for his friend Zubair, Shahidul La, the one who was told no and he died, on the street. Now Anas can't get to work, get to his next client. Why? Because you blocked the road. That's very serious. It's a public right. Blocking a public right is very harmful, which is why, demonstrations and stuff, there's fiqh related to mudaharat, demonstrations. They have to be done with due permission, etc. Just like, civil disobedience needs to be civil for it to be civil disobedience, right? That you need permissions and so on. These are good norms, right? And you have to stick within those boundaries, because you are occupying, like a protest or a march you are now occupying a public space. So you have to do it with permission, right? Except in the utmost extreme circumstances. But then you have to seek permission. Right? Which is why the norms in these places, you want to have a protest, ahlan wa sahlan, but get permission. Right? Someone said, what a lame protest. You get a permission from the oppressor to protest? Well, we're a religion of laws. Right? Chaos is not from our deen. Right? And these are, which is why a number of fuqaha, Mufti Taqi Usmani, others have fiqh related to protests. And the fiqh related to protests is one, they have to be in themselves, according to the dawabit of the shara. Amongst them, there's permission, because it's public, this is the public rights. And number two, that they should not result in greater harm, which happens in some Muslim countries. There's a protest, and they vandalize, and if that's expected, then the people organizing the protest are morally responsible to ensure that that's not reasonably feared. That's not reasonably feared, that there won't be crime and vandalism and the destruction of individual or public property arising from it. And there's fiqh related to the protests. But holding janazas on the street is not feasible, right? And also in private property is not normally permissible. It's makruh. Without the owner's permission, right? So without the owner's permission, that's one harm. And number two, because some people might not be able to get there, right? Some people may not be able to get there. Right? And it's a public, right? So let's say Rafi wanted to attend the funeral, but they're having it in someone's backyard. Right? Now he may feel awkward. Can I go inside, etc.? So there may be. But if there's permission, etc., but normally that's not the place to do it. But there could be extenuating circumstances where it would be permitted. Like, for example, when a Muslim community is young, right? In a place where there isn't a Muslim graveyard, etc., they couldn't find a place, they could do it. So it's not intrinsically wrong. It's because you can't just go to some open field and say, we'll do it there. But that field belongs to somebody. Then what about miscarriages? And this is one of those things that so many people don't know. And it's actually, miscarriages are so much more common than people imagine. Right? So this is one of those things. And one could diagram this, and you do yourself a favor by diagramming it. Right? Because a miscarriage could happen really early, there's nothing there. It's like, oops, right, kind of thing. But then there's stages of what is miscarriage, what is miscarried, right? So, he says, وَمَنِ اسْتَهَلَّ سُمِّيَ وَغُسِّلَ وَصُلِّيَ عَلَيْهِ. Right? So whoever, any child, any individual born, and istahalla, anyone born with signs of life, right? Meaning they moved, like the infant moved, like they had some moving limbs, and then they died. Or they produced sound, they cried, and then they died. Right? And I'm not trying to be light about it, but either they moved, so the baby came out, and it moved its arms, and then it died. Or they made a sound. They meaning the child, not the mother. Right? After more than half the child came out, if they came out feet first, and if they came out head first, then when they went past the navel, right? In that case, they are named, washed, and prayed over. Right? And in this case, even so, there's difference. How many people have to see the evidence that the child was alive? Why is it significant whether the child was alive or not when it came out? No. There's inheritance consequence. Child born alive and it dies. So child dies, mother dies. The child comes out alive, there's inheritance consequences. Right? So mother dies in miscarriage, child dies. There's circumstances where there'll be inheritance and there's circumstances where there won't. Right? Now, it gets tricky, right? So the child was born alive and then they died. Right? So the child would inherit. Right? So, mother gives birth to the infant. Infant's alive, mother dies. Infant dies after the mother. So when the mother died, if the infant was alive, there are inheritance consequences. Because the child will be one of the inheritors. And when the child dies, the child will have inheritors. Someone once commented that it makes me want to, witness such a case. And no, you shouldn't want to witness someone's death, right? But these are all real things that happen all the time, right? And some of them can be theoretically very interesting. Like some of these children, they mention something, right? Like, what if a child comes out in pieces? So one of my friends is Shaykh. He said, when I read it, I was like, what? Like, it's like when you go pick up the meat at the butcher's, like it comes out in pieces. But then there's a real case, right? That there's a situation where there's a pregnancy that's quite advanced, and the mother, they had to induce the baby. Why? Because the mother's life was in danger. So they actually had to cut up the infant inside and abort it because of. So sometimes things would be like, when studying, you may think something like, how would a child come out in pieces? There's some situations where abortion may be obligatory. Mother's life is in grave danger. She's going to bleed to death. Right? That's why also one should be very careful about, sometimes there's people who talk about just theorizing about issues like abortion, etc. Right? You take fiqh from the fuqaha. Right? And fatwa from the muftis. Right? And none of this is new to them. Right? There's real cases where they have to deal with. And only they are aware of all the surrounding circumstances. Right? And one shouldn't wish to be in their situation, because matters of life and death. Right? Matters of life and death. But the fuqaha only mention these things because they are often, they happen more commonly than people would imagine. So if the infant's born with any signs of life, movement, sound, after most of them came out, right? They are named. Ghusl is done for them and they're prayed over, right? Right? Now, what if the mother dies and the baby is still within the mother? If there's signs of life, you can cut her open to take the child out. And that's not considered to be from desecrating the dead. Because it's from saving a life. And they mentioned that from the Fatawa al-Zahiriyya. You can see it here, right? And if you want to look in Hashit al-Tahtawi, there's a bunch of, what if someone swallowed someone else's property and then they died? Right? So Sidi Hamza wanted his watch back, and his friend swallowed his new smartwatch. And it caused some reactions within the person and they died. Now, Sidi Hamza said, I love that watch. It's a Mubarak watch. I got it from Shaykh Azhar. You just be materially compensated. Because you're right, there, the inviolability of the dead is stronger than your right to your property. So in that case, that's considered to be inflicting a grave harm on the dead, to cut them open for your smartwatch, like someone swallowed a Fitbit or whatever. So then you'd just be compensated for it, right? And this goes back to the principles of harm. Anyone interested, you could look at الضرر الأعلى يدفع بارتكاب الضرر الأدنى. The greater harm is lifted by accepting the lesser harm. So let's say Sidi Hamza is getting married tomorrow, right? And he took off his ring to make wudu at Sidi Farid's farm. So Farid's free-range chicken farms. What happened? His chickens got a bit too free. One of his prize roosters came, swallowed the ring that you're going to give to your intended. Farid says, I love my rooster. I named him after my name. Called Farid II. He's a rooster. We call him Faroodster or whatever. Right? So there's principle. Which is the lesser harm? Slaughtering Faroodster or you losing your ring? So I said normally we'd quarantine the rooster and let the ring come out. If that's feasible, then you do that. But now it's the day of the wedding. You need enough time to clean the ring too, because it's been in the rooster. So there's not enough time. He should agree to have the rooster slaughtered and the ring be taken out. We'd have to compensate him fully at the market value, not the emotional value, just the market value of the rooster. Because the greater harm would be you missing out on on the wedding ring that you're gifting, for example. And there's a bunch of things like this. But here the greater harm is mother dies, inviolability of the body of the mother. But if we have any reason to believe the child's still alive, the assumption would be that an infant in the belly is alive, then we would cut it open. Now, وَإِن لَمْ يَسْتَهِلَّ, what if the baby comes out, but, right, without signs of life, then they are washed, right? They're washed, and they're just wrapped, right, without all the whole proceedings, and they're buried. But they are not, if there's no signs of life, then what happens? There's no salah on them. Right? So three cases, like baby is born with signs of life and then dies. Three things: name, washing, burial. Child comes out with, right? And this the condition here, وَإِلَّمْ يَسْتَهِلَّ وَاسْتَبَانَ بَعْضُ خَلْقِهِ, right? What does it say in the وَاسْتَبَانَ بعض خلقته. What does it say in the Hashiyat in the Hadiyah al-Ala'iyya? It's mentioned it was واستبان بعض خلقته. Okay. But that's the right. Right.
In the notes it says سواء تم خلقه
Yeah.
أو لم
No.
يتم.
Yeah, that's in the Maraqi as well. Right? But this is if any of the form of the child is now defined, even if it be like, fingers or any part of the form. So it's not just a lump. Right? So any واستبان بعض خلقته. Right? وَلَمْ يُصَلَّ عَلَيْهِ. Right? And such an infant will also be resurrected. Right? So any miscarriage in which some of the form of the child has appeared, what do? We wash them and we bury them. And this is a common mistake. There's many people, because they just dispose of them. But there's a burial. And that infant that died in a miscarriage, they'll be resurrected with their parents. Right? Right? وَيُحْشَرْ إِنْ بَانَ بَعْضُ خَلْقِهِ. Right? As he says. And they'll be resurrected if any part of them right? And so the Hanafis say that a siqt, the miscarriage, will be resurrected, and one is hopeful of their intercession. One's hopeful of their intercession, right? Right? And there's hadith related to this, right? In Tabarani, in both the Mu'jam al-Awsat and al-Kabir, that Imam Tahtawi quotes it. It's in that in السقطة ليقف على باب الجنة. Right? The siqt stands at the door of paradise and says, I will not enter until my parents do. And this is important, there's a few other hadith as well. Right, that there's a hadith in Sunan Abi Dawud that the miscarried infant argues with its Lord if its parents do not enter paradise. Right? And of course, where in account of where there's faith but some shortcomings, right? Now, it is not per se sunnah there to name that miscarriage. There's nothing particularly wrong with it either. So I said, can I name them? Go ahead. As long as they don't get too, some people go and tell stories on a weekly basis to their miscarriage. Well, that's excessiveness, right? And that's where the hadith of, that Allah is displeased with those who excessively visit graves. Right? We start doing those things. You're supposed to be living this life, right? So these are but of course, what's implicit is if nothing is manifest, then what happens? Then they're just, so there's three levels, right? If they're born alive and then they die, you do three things: name, wash, bury. If there's a miscarriage, right, but some of their form has appeared, what do? You wash and bury. Right? You wash and bury. Correct? If nothing is manifest, then you just bury. Right?
Manifested its form.
كصبي سبي مع أحد أبويه, like a child who was imprisoned with one of their two parents. Did I miss something? If a child, so the problem with the child is that let's say a child was captured with one of their fathers, brought to Muslim lands, and they all died. Right? What do we do with the children? With the child? They're buried with the child follows the rulings of the parents. Right? In worldly rulings. Right? So children of non-Muslims are buried with them. Even though they're technically, like what happens to them in the hereafter is different from what happens to them in this life. Like in a Muslim land, we wouldn't say, okay, just think about the practicalities. Right? Right? Some non-Muslims died in a Muslim land. Practically, you just hand them over. If there's a Christians died in a Muslim land, you hand them to the Christian community. Right? If there's no if there's no Christian community, then you just wrap them and bury them. We're not responsible for burying anybody. We just hand them to their people. So an atheist dies, like a Christian dies, you just hand them to the local church. An atheist dies, if there's no one to bury them, then we just bury them. Right? Without any of the. It gets trickier than that. And in confusing cases, one should go to the people of knowledge, right? إِلَّا أَن يُسْلِمَ أَحَدُهُمَا, unless one of them became Muslim. Right? If one parent is Muslim, the other is non-Muslim, we take the means for the child to be treated according to to the Muslim parent. Right? That's in the أو هو, or if the child themselves became Muslim, because a child reaches discerning age, they can become, their Islam is considered. Right? Sayyidina Ali embraced Islam as a child. Right? So much so that the fuqaha, the ulama differed, who was the first Muslim? And there's difference on it. And most have said that the absolutely first person to believe was Sayyidina Khadija. The first adult man was Sayyidina Abu Bakr, and the first child was Sayyidina Ali. There's some discussion, what about, we don't know decisively when other children of the Prophet, the children of the Prophet became Muslim. It was in that period, but أو لم يسبأ أحدهما, or if neither of them was captured with them. There's a non-Muslim child, let's say a non-Muslim child walked over the border and then fell into the river on the Muslim side and they died. But they're from the non-Muslim land, 100% non-Muslims in that land. We wouldn't force funerary practices on them. They had no Muslim parent that we know of. They're just, how are they treated? They're treated then according to the land. So a non-Muslim child walks over without their parents. Like, they've just, right? We bury them according to the land. If we can't ascribe them to the parents, we ascribe them to the land. So a non-Muslim child, we don't encourage people fleeing from there. I said, non-Muslim child came, and they don't have, if they have parents, there's someone who was captured and brought from a non-Muslim land, and then they died, we bury them according to the land. If they just walked over the border and they died, we just hand them over back to their people. It would cause quite a diplomatic row if you didn't do otherwise, right? وإن كان لكافر قريب مسلم غسله كغسل خرقة النجسة. Right? If a non-Muslim has a Muslim close relative, then the first thing you do is just you hand them to their people. Right? Otherwise you wash them fully, like you would wash. If something is dirty, you wash it clean, but you don't observe the sunnahs of washing. Because he doesn't believe in this. Imagine the dead person saying, like, what are you doing to me? I'm not Muslim. Right? If they could speak, would they want the Muslim funerary practices? No. Right? وكفنه في خرقة, and one just wraps them in a piece of cloth without all the other aspects. وألقاه في حفرة, and one puts them into a hole in the ground. أو دفعه إلى أهل ملته, or one hands them over to the people of their religious community, and that is actually the superior thing to do, right? Right? Now the apostate, and this gets tricky. The apostate, and apostasy is a very serious thing. Right? Because the whole purpose of existence is that that God be glorified, right? It's a very, very serious thing. Right? So if there's no one to hand them over to, then you just bury them. You don't even wash them then. Right? You just bury them, and that's it. Right? نسأل الله سبحانه وتعالى العافية. And then he says, ولا يصلى على. There's categories of people who are not preyed upon. Right? And this also returns to the judgment of the ruler, right? Because there may be, in some of the instances, a case to pray over them, right? Because in some situations, there's civil war going on. If you don't pray on them, there could be worse consequences. Or when tribes are involved, etc., it can get tricky. So these things return to the judgment of the imam. But the initial consideration is that وَلَا يُصَلَّ عَلَى بَاغٍ. One does not pray over rebels, even if Muslim, right? Because they destabilize the public well-being. So the harm of their not being prayed over is less than the public harm that they were inflicting, right? It serves as an example. Don't have military rebellion against the government. Right? وَقَاطِعِ الطَّرِيقِ, or a highway robber. Because highway robbers endanger the very lifeblood of cities, right? Of lands. Right? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, just consider Surah Quraysh. لِإِيلَافِ قُرَيْشِ إِيلَافِهِمْ رِحْلَةَ الشِّتَاءِ وَالصَّيْفِ. In honor of Quraysh, and what are they granted? The رِحْلَةَ الشِّتَاءِ وَالصَّيْفِ. The trade journey of the winter, which was to where? رحلة الشتاء was to Yemen. ورحلة الصيف was to Sham. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions that trade route as being what? From Allah's tremendous gift to Quraysh. And there's numerous reflections the ulama have given on that. Right? There's divine wisdoms and insights of the merit of trade and because of what opportunity it gives and so on, and that's why so many of the righteous directed them to trade, and the merit of trade that's come in the hadith and so on as well. فَلْيَعْبُدُوا رَبَّ هَذَا الْبَيْتِ. So let them worship the Lord of this house. But there's one of the greatest collective blessings are the trade routes. So cutting the trade route, or threatening it, or making people disinclined towards it through highway robbery, is one of the grave sins. Right? أو قاطع الطريق. Right? قتل حالة المحاربة. If they're killed during the battle with the authorities, right? وَقَاتِلٍ بِالْخَنْقِ غِيلَةً. And someone who kills by strangling treacherously. So someone goes and murders someone by strangling them, at night in their house, for example. So such kind of murder, they're not prayed over. Why? But they're disrupting basic public safety, right? And the like of them, right? وَمُكَابِرٍ فِي الْمِصْرِ لَيْلًا بِالسِّلَاحِ. Or someone who publicly attacks in the city with weapons. Right? And this comes up in what if a Muslim gang member was killed in a public shootout? That's where these things get very sensitive. Right? And it returns to the judgment in a Muslim land of the authorities, in a non-Muslim land of the local religious leadership. Should this person be prayed over or not? Right? And it requires wisdom. Some places, sadly, where there's widespread crime in inner cities, and there's Muslims who get stuck in these things too. Right? That's why it's not an absolute, that you cannot pray over them. Sometimes it requires discretion. Because there's a considerations related to the living, but also, will there be any deterrent effect in not praying over them? What is the effect on their family members, etc.? So it requires consideration. Right? وَمَقْتُولٍ عَصَبِيَّةً. Or someone killed in tribal, due to tribal disputes. Right? Why? This assuming that there is order, but some tribes have started fighting each other. Right? So let's say Bani Zubayr's family, Zubayr went and proposed to, asked for Zubayda's hand. So Uncle Jamil said no. So Zubayr died. So now Zubayr's family decide to kill somebody from their family. Out of what? Asabiyya. Your tribe dishonored our, this kind of thing. This is a very grave, grave matter, right? And then in that fighting, the aggressors, one of them died. So one can withhold praying over them, but one has to look at, is there a benefit in the withholding prayer? But also, are there harms from not praying over them? Right? It can sometimes aggravate social instability. So it needs, right? وَإِنْ غُسِّلُوا, but in that case they may be washed, right? And then the fatwa position in the Hanafi school, نسأل الله سبحانه وتعالى العافية, وَقَاتِلُ نَفْسِهِ يُغَسَّلْ وَيُصَلَّى عَلَيْهِ. Someone who killed themselves, meaning someone who committed suicide, right, is washed over and prayed over. And this is the relied upon position in the Hanafi school. There are opinions that in some cases they wouldn't be prayed over, right? But then there's also something, right? And this is where ignorance, many people, in my extended family in Pakistan, it actually happened. Someone committed suicide. And people refused to pray over him. It caused, so already the family was deeply traumatized. The guy blew his brains out. He shot himself, splattered his brains on the wall. It's really quite a gruesome. And the family was they're dealing with many other traumas. And then the local masjid refuses to pray over him. Right? So one that relied upon position in the Hanafi school is that you do pray over them. It's right here, right? But also, this is where little knowledge is of great harm, right? They say, قَلِيلُ عِلْمٍ أَضَرُّ مِنْ كَثِيرِ جَهْلٍ. A little knowledge is more harmful than a lot of ignorance. So it also says, وَقَاتِلْ نَفْسِهِ عَمْدًا. This one, someone who killed themselves deliberately. لَا لِشِدَّةِ وَجَعٍ. Not due to intense pain, right? And the pain could be physical pain, or could also be, there's people who have, medical levels of depression and trauma, etc. That's excluded from this. Not that the ruling of suicide is that it's impermissible, right? Now, some people, if someone has those situations, it's not permitted to commit suicide morally. But the difference of opinion arises when someone just chose to, like on a lark, they decided to just kill themselves. So if I'm going to go to Jannah anyways, might as well go now. Or something like that, right? Or for a silly reason. Zubayr has no other trauma, just that. Zubaydah said no, so I'm going to kill myself. That's where you don't want to get people like, but in those sensitive issues, right? There's it's a very careful thing. Although, and in itself, we're not talking about those problem cases. With those things, we leave that to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We don't have to make moral judgments on someone who's dead. We have to deal now with the living, right? Like, the akhirah is not up for democratic votes. So Sidi Azhar Bhai Jan, there's a country named after him. Okay? Azhar Bhai Jan, should we deem him from Ahl al-Jannah or not? None of your business, right? It's okay, we pray over him and leave that to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It's a public consideration. Would this serve as a deterrent? In our times, it wouldn't. It would actually cause a lot of harm to the family, etc. But in itself, when there's no such circumstances, someone killing themselves is worse than killing another person. The first person who has rights over you is yourself. Right? Now there's some hadith about, and this is the danger of fiqh like that, the hadith about killing oneself. This applies to when there's, like that they won't enter paradise, etc. That means that they've committed a grave wrong. They'll be taken into account for that. Right? And also there's a case for people struggling with mental health issues, etc. They could be at a level of insanity. That's the simplest way of having husn al-dhan. Someone has mental health issues, that was insanity. Right? Insanity. It's very possible. Someone has mental health issues, people do some of the strangest things. Right? So, and these things require sensitivity, right? They require sensitivity, and don't. And that's from the harms of not having learned people in our community. I know from Shaykh Zahir, for example, he's had to intercede a number of times in these kinds of situations because people go, and there's the consideration of the living. وَلَا عَلَى قَاتِلِ أَحَدِ أَبَوَيْهِ عَامِدًا. Right? One does not pray over someone who deliberately killed one of their parents. Right? As opposed to if it was done like in war or rightfully or by mistake. Someone backed into their, into a family member, into a parent who was gardening, and they reversed into their nasallallahu al-afiyah. So that is the, that is some of the dispersed fiqh related to the funeral prayer. And then he talks about في حملها ودفنها, in carrying the janazah and in burying it, right? So that's what we're going to look at next week, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. And then he has a beautiful section on visiting graves. And there's a lot of adab of visiting graves, right? 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 And there's some really beautiful points from Hashiyat al-Tahtawi as well. And one of the big mistakes, and this from the harmful reading of, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, وَأَلَّيْسَ لِلْإِنسَانِ إِلَّا مَا سَعَى, and each person will only have what they strived for. Right? Yeah, it says that, but do you know what it means? There's at least 8 major interpretations in mainstream Sunni scholarship of what this means. Right? Right? And, and this is, right? And rather, there are many hadiths, and, and the issue of donating reward and so on. Right? Right? There's, one of the interpretations of it, this is why you can't, the early Muslims said that man fassara al-Qur'ana bi ra'yihi faqad akhta'a wa in asab. The one who interprets the Qur'an by their own opinion has erred, meaning has sinned, even if they're correct. That's what it says. What is tafsir? Is ta'yinu ma'na al-ayah, is to specify the meaning of a verse. Who said? You read it. Are you a master of the Arabic language? Are you master of the science of interpretation? And if you're not, so you can interpret it yourself if you have the tools of interpretation. Or you are relating reliable interpretation. And there's 2 types of tafsir, 2 types of specification of meaning. Someone could be a mujtahid in tafsir, which is the art of specifying the meaning of a verse. So Ibn Arafah, a brilliant Maliki jurist and theologian, basically, when it comes to interpreting a Quranic verse, right? Someone's either a mujtahid in tafsir, which is they themselves have the tools of language and interpretation to engage in tafsir, and that is a rare matter. Even Sayyidina Abu Bakr as-Siddiq, he said, أي سماء تظلني وأي أرض تقلني إذا قلت في كتاب الله برأيي. Said, what sky will shelter me and what ground would carry me if I spoke about the book of Allah out of mere opinion? It's serious. That's Sayyidina Abu Bakr. Or the other is, you are someone who's not got that quality, then you're transmitting the opinion of those who are qualified. Ikrimah, who's one of the early Muslims, he said that verse وَأَلَّيْسَ لِلْإِنسَانِ إِلَّا مَا سَعَى was specific to those before the ummah of the Prophet ﷺ. That applied to people before us, even قَوْمِ إِبْرَاهِيمَ وَمُوسَى, even the people of Ibrahim and Musa alayhim as-salam. Says, but it's, as for this ummah, they are rewarded for their striving and that which is strived on their behalf. That's one of the 8 major interpretations. Right? So, right? So we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for ease and facilitation. So we'll stop at carrying the funeral and burying, and these are often neglected. One of the bad habits, one of the opportunities that people miss, that even if you're not going to be able to attend the burial, right? Where you can readily attend the burial, there's great reward in it. Particularly if there's a family member, etc., you should. It's from tamam al-janaza. So there's things that come before. Right? Those tend to be more private, right? The washing, etc. But all of these are opportunities to remember death. So if you are able to participate in those, and there's a fard kifaya, if you can, contribute by that in the community, that's a beneficial thing. Someone learns, then you say, okay, I want to learn this better. So they learn it. Doesn't take a long time. Also to observe people who do it properly. And then, you can participate in that. Because these remind of death. But then there's the janazah. But one of the unfortunate mistakes that even a lot of time people you'd expect much better from is that you don't have, carrying the janazah out of, after the funeral, there's tremendous merit mentioned for it. You find a lot of time they're done, and then they're just talking to someone. It's nothing urgent. Even if you can walk some steps, and the sunnah is to walk some steps from all 4 sides of the janazah. Sometimes actually no one's bothering to carry the guy, carry the person. Right? So, well, we've got a tray. No. You've got the trolley. Or at least, push it with the thing. But the sunnah is to carry them at shoulder level, etc. We'll see. So to participate in that properly, according to the adab, this is an opportunity. And this is an opportunity. And also, so even if it be within the hall, there's X number of steps. So that's one of the things not to forget. Okay, not to forget. Even if you couldn't go to the janazah. They even say if you walk a few steps outside, like it's the masjid, you walk to the extent, you're going to walk to your car anyways, just walk the janazah out to a little distance. Okay, to a little distance. There may be some cases where you couldn't attend. The ulama had tremendous prioritization. Imam Abdul Ra'uf al-Munawi, the author of Fayd al-Qadir, his own son died. His son died, I think, at the age of 26 or so. There's mentioned by Shaykh Abdul Fattah Abu Ghudda in one of his books on the scholarship, Qimat al-Zaman or Safahat min Sabr al-Ulama. His son died. He walked him. There's a madrasa complex, whatever. So he walked them to the gates of the madrasa, and he bid him farewell. And his son was a young alim. He was in his mid-20s or so. Bade him farewell so he wouldn't delay his lesson. Right? Shaykh Ibrahim al-Yaqubi, rahmatullahi alayhi, he taught a lesson with a bundle next to him. in the morning at the Umawi. After the lesson, he asked the people around, said, my baby died this morning. Can any of you help me with the washing and proceedings? But he did the lesson. That's how they... Imam Abu Yusuf attended only part of the washing of his son. Why? He said, I don't want to miss being in the first row of Abu Hanifa's class. It's not that not to get there on time, to be there in the first row. Why? Because there's sunnah of, when there's benefit, one goes, one gets to benefit early, and one doesn't sit back from benefit. It's a very scary hadith about 3 sets of people who came to the masjid of the Prophet ﷺ while the Prophet ﷺ was in a circle. One person came and sat right at the front. Another felt a bit shy, they held back. And one looked at them and he walked away. The Prophet ﷺ praised the first one and mildly castigated the second. There's praise that he attended, but that he held back from benefit. He noted that. And the third turned away. The Prophet ﷺ said that. And apparently he was not busy or anything. It was castigated because he held back from benefit. Nasallallahu al-afiyah. Go ahead.
In the scenario we mentioned, if someone comes late to a janaza, the assumption was that they know how many takbeers have been given. In the situation where you walked in and assumed it was the first takbeer, but it was the second takbeer,
No harm.
you just recite and the imam says the last and does the salam and you start making the supplication.
Yeah. So if you when you don't know, it's the same principle, right? When you're not sure, what do? Use your judgment. If you use your judgment, you got it wrong, you did your duty, so you just act accordingly, right? So you thought it's probably it took me a while to get up the masjid. You weren't counting the takbirs as you get into the masjid, so you thought it was the third takbir, so you made the dua, right? So then just go back and recite what you missed. And there's no order or anything, right? Because the actual reciting the dua, etc., is...
So in this situation, you actually recited everything. You recited it from the salawat and the dua, and then so you would just do an extra takbir and get the salam.
Yeah.
In the order of rank, who's given the preference for leading the prayer? You mentioned that they can. Is it that somebody higher up can forego their rights and then just go straight down to the next step?
Or they can also delegate someone else. So the qadi says that they have a dignitary. They have a visiting scholar from somewhere else. They could appoint them. Now, in later times, the ulama generally said, let us take care of the religious practices. Because the umara, the rulers, tended to be ignorant or lack religious things. So they just said, in religious matters, let us do it. Right? And that differed, right, in Ottoman time. And they sort of made, with wisdom, they made arrangements such that religious things were left to the ulama.
So this person, there's an order of preference. A person chooses instead to delegate it to somebody else. That person has the same order of preference. So someone below that chain can't then say, like the imam of the masjid can't say, oh, now I want to pray over this scholar who was assigned by the qadi.
No.
Okay? Now, can the delegate then delegate it further?
No. Because you only have a right, so that's like if you have an agent, right? So let's say Sidi Rafi is going shopping. So I said, he said, would you like anything? So you say, well, can you buy me a suitable shawl? Because you like Sidi Rafi's taste, refined man, right? But then can Sidi Rafi go and appoint someone else on your behalf? No. You only delegated them. Right? So that doesn't devolve. Right? So if Sidi Rafi accepts to buy a shawl on your behalf, he cannot delegate it further unless the permission included the right to delegate it further. That's wakala. That's the fiqh related to agency.